Two men, one log, one saw. That is where this story begins. Not in a factory, not in a mill, not beside any river or any machine. Just two men in an open field, one standing on top of a log and one crouching beneath it in a hole in the ground, dragging a 7-foot blade back and forth through green timber until their lungs gave out and their arms stopped working. 12 boards. That is what they could produce in a full day. 12 boards from sunup to sundown. Not enough to frame a single wall, not enough to floor a small room. 12 boards, the full output of two grown men working themselves hollow from dawn to dusk. Hold that number in your head because this entire story is built around it. Every house in colonial America was made of wood. Every barn, every church, every ship launched from every harbor on the Atlantic coast, every bridge, every wharf, every fence, every coffin, millions of structures, billions of boards. And for the first century of European settlement on this continent, virtually every plank that went into those structures had to be ripped from a log by hand, one agonizing stroke at a time. This is the story of how that changed. But it is also the story of how the change nearly broke the men who made it happen, and sometimes did break them in ways that don't appear in the history books. Because between the pit saw and the chainsaw lies a gap of 300 years. And in that gap, men built a world out of timber, using machines that had no guards, no kill switches, and no mercy for the inattentive. The tools were ingenious, the labor was brutal, the death toll was real, and the story has almost been forgotten. We are going to remember it. Before you can understand what replaced the whipsaw, you have to spend a few minutes in the pit. Not metaphorically. Literally. In the ground. Pit sawing was not a colonial American invention. It was ancient. For centuries, across every civilization that worked with wood, the method for turning a round log into a flat board was the same. You dug a trench in the earth, 5 or 6 feet deep, or you built a raised platform of heavy timbers which achieved the same result, a log suspended above a man-sized gap with room for a human being below. Then you rolled a log across the top of the pit and secured it with iron spikes called log dogs, bent metal rods hammered into the wood to keep it from rolling. Two men took their positions. The top sawyer climbed onto the log. He was the senior man, the one with more experience, more skill, more muscle in his upper body. He was sometimes called the top dog, a phrase that may or may not have found its way into the English language from exactly this practice. The second man descended into the pit. He was the pitman, he was the junior man, the apprentice, the new arrival. He was also, without question, the one getting the worse end of the deal. Between them they held a whipsaw, a narrow blade stretched in a wooden frame, 5 to 7.5 feet long, with a handle at each end. The frame kept the blade taut, the way a bow keeps a bowstring tight. The top sawyer guided the cut along a chalk line drawn down the length of the log, keeping the blade tracking straight so the board came out even thickness. He pulled the saw upward on his stroke. The pitman hauled it down on his. Gravity helped the pitman on the cutting stroke. That was the only thing that helped the pitman. Everything else about his position was misery. He stood in a dark trench, arms raised above his head, pulling down on a blade that was constantly raining debris onto his face. Sawdust fell into his eyes, his mouth, his ears. It coated his skin, mixed with sweat, turned to a paste that clogged his nostrils. By midday, a pitman's face was unrecognizable. By evening, his lungs had processed more sawdust than clean air. He could not see the cut line. He could not guide the blade. His job was purely mechanical. Pull, release, hour after hour, stroke after stroke. In the dark, in the dust, with no way to know how much longer there was to go until the log was finished. The top sawyer had his own miseries. He fought gravity with every upstroke while simultaneously keeping the blade tracking true along the chalk line. A wandering cut meant a board of uneven thickness, ruined before it was finished. A lapse in rhythm meant the saw binding in the kerf, the narrow channel left by the blade, and both men had to stop, drive wooden wedges into the cut to hold it open, reposition, and start over. Every interruption cost time, every restart costs energy. Both men burned out by noon. Both men were hollowed out by evening. Arms dead, grip locked, shoulders worn to raw muscle. A good two-man team, working from first light until they lost the light, could cut roughly a dozen boards from a single log. 12 boards. That was a respectable day's work. That was what had built the English Navy, plank by plank, stroke by stroke, in saw pits scattered across the dockyards of coastal England for generations. Now picture the American colonies. It is 1620. You have arrived on a shore blanketed in forest. White pine growing 250 feet tall, several feet thick at the base, trees so massive that a single trunk weighs 15 tons. The forest is limitless in every direction, but your labor force is tiny, unskilled, half dead from disease, and desperately short on time. You need lumber. Desperately. For fortifications, for housing, for ships, and the only method you know is 2 men and a pit. The math was fatal. 12 boards a day cannot build a colony, not when you need thousands of boards for a single ship, not when winter is coming and your people are dying under canvas. Something had to change, and someone across the ocean had already figured out what. The idea of using something other than human muscle to drive a saw did not begin in America. It did not even begin in the Middle Ages. It began in the Roman Empire. The oldest known mechanical sawmill was carved in stone on the sarcophagus of a man named Marcus Aurelius Ammios in the ancient city of Hierapolis in what is now western Turkey, sometime in the 3rd century AD. The carving shows a water wheel connected through a system of gears, cranks, and connecting rods to a reciprocating saw blade. Ammios was apparently so proud of this machine that he had it engraved on his tomb. He had reason to be proud. What that carving depicts is the earliest known use of a crank combined with a connecting rod, the fundamental mechanical principle that converts rotary motion into reciprocating motion. Round and round becomes back and forth, water wheel becomes saw stroke. It is the mechanical insight that would eventually power everything. A century after Ammios, the Roman poet Ausonius wrote about the shrieking sound of a water-powered saw cutting marble along the Moselle River in Germany. The technology spread across the empire. Similar mills were documented in modern Jordan, modern Turkey, across the imperial territories. The sound of water-driven blades had been echoing through the Roman world for generations, and then the empire fell, and the knowledge faded, and the pit saw came back. For nearly 1,000 years, the mechanical sawmill vanished from the historical record. When it reappeared in France in the late 13th century, a sketch in the notebooks of an architect named Villard de Honnecourt around 1250, it was rediscovered rather than transmitted. The idea had to be reinvented from scratch. From France, it spread slowly across continental Europe, Germany, Scandinavia, the Low Countries. Each nation adapted it to its local resources, sometimes water, sometimes wind, sometimes both. The pivotal moment came in 1594 in the Netherlands. A Dutch windmill operator named Cornelis Corneliszoon van Uitgeest, a man who described himself simply as a poor farmer with a wife and children, realized he could use a crankshaft to convert the circular motion of his windmill into the reciprocating stroke needed to drive a saw blade. He built his first mill on a raft, floating on a canal. He patented the crankshaft design in 1593 and refined it through the following decade. The results were staggering. What had taken 2 pit saws 120 working days could now be accomplished in 4 or 5. His invention was roughly 30 times faster than sawing by hand. 30 times. That number changed history. The Zaan district north of Amsterdam became the world's first industrial zone, eventually housing over 600 windmills, many of them devoted to cutting timber. Dutch shipyards could produce vessels faster and cheaper than any other nation in Europe. The Dutch East India Company built its fleet, a nation of barely 1.5 million people, fighting a war of independence against Spain, became the richest maritime power on earth. The sawmill was not the only reason, but it was one of the foundations. Cheap lumber made cheap ships. Cheap ships made trade routes. Trade routes made empire. And the empire was built on the back of a crankshaft that Cornelis Corneliszoon invented on a raft. He died around 1600, still calling himself a poor farmer. In 2004, excavations along a canal near Alkmaar accidentally uncovered the remains of his original raft mill 400 years after the water took it. Meanwhile, England was doing none of this. The London Sawyers Guilds had actively resisted mechanization. Hand sawyers attacked a mechanized mill in London as late as 1768, nearly 2 centuries after the Dutch had transformed their entire economy with water-driven blades. The English clung to the whipsaw while the rest of Europe harnessed wind and water, because the men whose livelihoods depended on the pit were willing to fight to keep it. They were protecting their families. But the result was that when the English colonists arrived in America and desperately needed mills, they had to recruit foreign expertise. That is exactly what they tried to do, and the first attempt was a disaster. In 1608, the Virginia Company shipped 70 new settlers to the struggling colony at Jamestown. Among them were 8 German and Polish craftsmen, glassmakers, carpenters, and lumber specialists, brought over at considerable expense to help build the colony's infrastructure. By 1620, the company had specifically recruited German sawmill wrights and sent them to the Tidewater region of Virginia with instructions to build water-powered mills. It did not work. The Tidewater was too flat. A water wheel needs a stream with a significant drop, enough velocity to turn the wheel against the resistance of a saw blade biting through hardwood. The coastal lowlands had rivers, but they were slow and gentle. The terrain upstream, where rivers dropped over rocky shelves and gathered real speed, was controlled by the Powhatan Confederacy, which was preparing for a general uprising that would kill over 300 colonists in 1622. The German millwrights could not get to the sites they needed, could not find labor to help construct anything, and could not even reliably feed themselves in a colony that was barely producing enough food for anyone. The first chapter of American sawmilling ended before it began. The breakthrough came further north. In 1634, at a place called Great Works on the river now known as the Great Works River in South Berwick, Maine, English millwrights built what is widely considered the first successful water-powered sawmill in North America. The site was ideal, a rocky gorge with a natural waterfall, vast stands of white pine stretching in every direction. Captain John Mason had contracted the project, and a model of the mill had been sent from England on a ship called the Pied Cow 3 years earlier, so the millwrights knew exactly what they were building before they broke ground. The logic was simple and irresistible. New England had everything needed for water-powered milling: steep terrain, fast-flowing rivers, immense forests, and a severe shortage of manpower. There were not enough hands to cut lumber the old way, but there was more moving water than anyone could ever use. Thomas Eliot, a Pennsylvania millwright, summed up the economics in 1795 with a single line that echoed across the frontier for another century. One mill, attended by one good man, if in good order, will saw more than 20 men with whipsaws, and much more cheaply. One man in a river replacing 20 men in a pit. The technology spread through necessity at a pace that looked almost like panic. By the 1680s, 24 sawmills operated in southern Maine alone. By 1706, 70 mills were running across the colonies. By 1840, approximately 5,500 sawmills operated in New England, with nearly 700 in Connecticut alone. Every stream with a decent drop had a mill on it. Every new township offered free land and cash bounties to any millwright willing to build one, because everyone understood the same arithmetic. Without a sawmill, nothing else could be built. The mill was always the first permanent structure in a frontier settlement. The town grew from it like a body grows from a heartbeat. That is why American place names are still littered with the evidence. Sawmill Creek, Mill Road, Mill River, Mill Pond, Milltown. The geography itself remembers what stood there first. So what was the machine? Picture a wooden building, typically 2 stories, set on stone piers beside a stream. The structure looks rough: hand-hewn timbers, cedar shingle roof, a flume of water running beneath. Upstream, a dam of stacked logs, fieldstone, and packed earth holds back a mill pond. A narrow channel called the head race carries water from the pond to the mill. After passing through the wheel, the water exits through a tail race back into the stream below. In the lower level of the building sat the heart of the machine, the water wheel. The most common type in American sawmills was called a flutter wheel, a small undershot wheel, only about 2.5 to 3 feet in diameter, mounted on a horizontal shaft. Water rushed across its flat paddles and spun it fast. 100 to 140 revolutions per minute. It was not particularly efficient. An overshot wheel, where water poured onto the wheel from above, could capture 85% of the water's energy. A flutter wheel captured far less, but flutter wheels were cheap, easy to build, and ran at the high speeds that sawing required. For most frontier millwrights working with limited resources and no time to spare, they were exactly right. On the flutter wheel's shaft sat an iron crank. Attached to the crank was a wooden arm called the pitmen, named, with pointed irony, after the man it had put out of a job. The pitman arm connected to a heavy rectangular wooden frame called the sash, which held a straight iron saw blade about 6 feet long. The sash slid up and down in grooved wooden posts, exactly like a window sash sliding in its frame, which is precisely where the name came from. As the wheel turned, the crank converted its circular motion into reciprocating motion. Rise, fall, roughly 100 strokes per minute. The saw cut on the downstroke. On the upstroke, a connecting arm at the top of the sash activated a rocker mechanism linked to a large ratcheted wheel called the rag wheel. The rag wheel's teeth engaged wooden pegs in the log carriage and inched it forward, a tiny, precise advance, synchronized with the saw's rhythm. The log crept into the blade 1/fraction of an inch at a time, and the blade ate through it stroke by stroke. Here is what made the system genuinely elegant. Everything was mechanically linked. The same water that drove the blade also advanced the log. No second power source. No human hand to push the timber forward. The sawyer's job was to set the log, start the water, monitor the cut, and stop the carriage when the blade reached the end of the log. One man could run the entire operation. Here is something that surprises people. Most of this machine was made of wood. The sash, the pitman arm, the rag wheel, the gears, the carriage, the building itself, all wood. Only the saw blade, the iron crank, a few gudgeon pins, and the log dogs that clamped the timber to the carriage were metal. In the earliest colonial mills, even those few iron components had to be imported from England because colonial blacksmiths could not yet produce them to the required tolerances. William Byrd of Virginia was writing letters to England in the 1680s requesting sawmill ironwork with precise instructions that the crank be made exactly according to the enclosed pattern. The machine built itself from the same material it was designed to cut. A colonial sash sawmill could cut about 1,000 board feet per day in softwood. Compare that to 12 boards from a pit saw team, and you understand why the technology spread with such urgency. It was not fast by any later standard. A modern computerized sawmill processes 2 million board feet in the same time. But in 1650, 1,000 board feet per day was the difference between a colony and a ruin. Step inside a running mill, and you understood it with your body rather than your mind. The air was thick with the smell of fresh-cut pine, sharp, clean, almost sweet, mixed with the mineral tang of wet stone from the mill race and the warm, earthy smell of river water churning through the wheel pit below. The sound was rhythmic and relentless. The groan of the sash rising, the rasp of the blade biting down, the clatter of the rag wheel teeth advancing the carriage, the rush of water beneath everything. The whole building vibrated in time with the stroke. You felt it in the soles of your boots, in your chest, in your teeth. It was not just a sound, it was a sensation. The mill was alive in a way that no static structure could be, and compared to 2 men, a pit, and 12 boards a day, it was a miracle. But here is what nobody tells you about miracles. They have conditions. This one's conditions had nothing to do with the machine itself. They had to do with the sky. Operating a sawmill was not a year-round occupation. It was a seasonal negotiation with the river, and the river always had the final word. The best power came in late winter and early spring, when snowmelt filled the streams and the mill pond was flush. This coincided neatly with the logging cycle. Trees were felled in winter, when the ground was frozen and logs could be skidded across snow by horse or ox teams. Come spring, the logs arrived at the mill just as the water was strongest. By late summer, many streams slowed to a trickle. Drought could shut a mill down for weeks. No water meant no wheel. No wheel meant no saw. No saw meant no lumber. And no lumber meant the carpenter waiting for boards went elsewhere, and the millwright's income evaporated with the stream. Winter brought ice, and ice was the enemy. A hard freeze could lock the water wheel solid, crack its wooden paddles, or dam the headrace with a solid plug that no man could clear fast enough. The spring thaw brought its own violence. Freshets, sudden floods from rapid snowmelt, could destroy a dam in hours. Milwaukee lost its main mill dam to freshets 2 years running in 1866 and 1867, and those losses convinced most mill owners there to abandon water power for steam. The millwright was the most essential figure in this world. He was part carpenter, part engineer, part hydraulic specialist. He selected the site, surveyed the drop in the stream, designed the dam, calculated the headrace gradient, built the water wheel, carved the wooden gears, aligned the saw sash, and calibrated the feed mechanism so the carriage advanced at exactly the right rate for the species and grain of the wood being cut. When something broke, and something always broke, the millwright was the one who could fix it. A skilled millwright was so valuable to a frontier community that some townships paid his full salary from public funds, treating him the way a modern municipality treats a water engineer. He was infrastructure. If he left, the mill might stop. If the mill stopped, the town stopped. The sawyer, the man who operated the machine daily, needed a different kind of skill. He read each log before it was loaded, checking for bark patterns, branch stubs, and the dark stains that might indicate a buried nail or a length of old fence wire. A hidden nail could shatter the blade. A major knot could stall the cut. The sawyer judged the grain, chose his starting face, and listened to the sound of the saw in the wood. A clean cut sang, a dull blade growled. A blade about to bind went quiet in a particular way, a dropping of pitch, a change in resonance that raised the hair on the back of the neck of any experienced man. Sharpening was constant. After every few logs, the sawyer stopped the water, locked the sash, and went at the blade with a hand file, tooth by tooth, restoring the edge and resetting the angle of each tooth, bent alternately left and right so the kerf would be slightly wider than the blade itself, preventing it from binding in the cut. Bad filing meant a wandering cut, a burned board, or a broken blade. In the early mills, a replacement blade might take weeks to arrive from England. The sawyer's file was as important as the saw itself. And then there was sawdust. It accumulated relentlessly under the carriage, around the stone piers, in the gearing, in the sawyer's boots and hair and lungs. Some of it was useful. Farmers used it for animal bedding. Mill operators packed it around blocks of ice cut from the mill pond in winter, and the insulation kept the ice solid well into summer. But most of the sawdust was simply a fire waiting for a spark. Sawdust and friction and resinous wood and wooden buildings, the combination was almost inevitable. Many mills burned and were rebuilt multiple times over their lifetimes. Fire was not a hazard. It was an expectation. You planned for it the way you planned for winter. Water rights disputes clogged colonial courts from the earliest days because the man who controlled the dam controlled the lifeblood of the community. Massachusetts mill laws dating from 1713 tried to regulate these disputes, establishing that mill dams could only flood a neighbor's land if the mill served the public good. That principle, the idea that a sawmill existed for common benefit, not merely private profit, was baked into American law from the very beginning. The mill also served as a social center. Farmers bringing logs to be cut waited their turn, and while they waited, they talked. News traveled through the sawmill. Deals were struck there. Disputes were settled. In some communities, the same water wheel that drove the saw also powered a grist mill, a lathe, or a shingle cutter through a system of shared shafts and pulleys. A gunsmith might rent space to use the wheel's power for a metal lathe. A furniture maker might tap the same wheel for a wood-turning rig. The mill was not just a machine, it was infrastructure. It was the center of gravity around which everything else arranged itself. Now we get to the part that does not appear in most histories of early American industry. The water-powered sash sawmill was not the most dangerous machine ever built. It was not fast enough or powerful enough for that distinction. But it demanded respect every minute of every hour of every operating day, and it punished anyone who forgot. The blade had no guard, 6 feet of iron teeth stroking through open air, 100 times a minute. The sawyer worked within arm's reach of it for hours at a stretch. There was no emergency shutoff. To stop the blade, you had to walk to the headgate and close it, cutting the water supply to the wheel. That took time. And when you closed the gate, the blade did not stop instantly. It coasted on momentum, still lethal for several strokes after the water was cut. A stumble on the sawdust-covered floor, a loose sleeve catching the sash, a hand reaching to clear a chip too close to the downstroke. The machine did not distinguish between wood and flesh. Every sawyer who worked a mill understood this the way a sailor understands the ocean, not as a threat to be eliminated, but as a condition to be respected every single moment. There was no alternative. The blade ran. You stayed aware. The one time you were not aware was the one time you could not afford. The moving parts below the floor were equally unforgiving. The water wheel, the crank, the pitman arm, all driven by the constant force of the stream, all exposed, all capable of crushing or trapping a limb during maintenance. Greasing bearings, clearing jams, replacing broken paddles on the wheel, all of this had to be done by hand. Sometimes while the water was still flowing, because stopping the wheel for minor maintenance cost operating time that a mill running on seasonal water supply could not spare. The dam carried its own category of risk. Every mill dam was a wager against the river. The same water that powered your livelihood could erase it in an afternoon along with everything downstream. Dams in the colonial and early American era were not built by engineers with survey instruments and load calculations. They were built by the millwright and whatever hands he could muster, using logs, fieldstone, and packed earth. Some held for decades, others did not. The catastrophic failure was always a possibility, and when it came fast. The most devastating dam failure in New England history occurred on the Mill River in Massachusetts. In 1864, 11 mill owners formed a reservoir company and built a dam to guarantee year-round water flow. They designed it themselves to save money, overruling the protests of their own surveyor and construction workers, who warned that the earth embankment was not sound. On the morning of May 16, 1874, the dam keeper watched a 40-foot slab of earth slide off the face of the dam. Within minutes, 600 million gallons of water erupted through the breach in a wall 40 feet high. It swept away 4 towns. It killed 139 people in under an hour. Most of the dead were women, children, and the elderly. People who had no warning and no path to high ground. That disaster led directly to the first dam safety legislation in American history. For more than 200 years, from the 1630s through the 1850s, virtually every board used to build colonial and early American structures passed through a water-powered sash mill. The evidence is still visible in old buildings. Look at the beams in a colonial farmhouse and you will see characteristic straight parallel saw marks, the signature of a reciprocating sash blade. Those marks are not decoration, they are history. They tell you that a river cut this wood. The end came from 2 directions simultaneously, and both were irreversible. The first was steam. Starting around 1810, high-pressure steam engines began appearing in sawmills. The equation changed fundamentally. A steam-powered mill did not need a river. It did not freeze in winter or go dry in August. It could run anywhere there was timber and the fuel was the mill's own waste. Scrap lumber and bark fired the boiler that drove the saw. The machine consumed its own offcuts to keep running. For mill operators who had spent careers fighting frozen wheels and summer droughts and spring floods that washed their dams away, steam must have seemed like deliverance. But steam brought its own violence. In 1880 alone, there were 159 boiler explosions across the United States. During the 1850s, boiler explosions occurred on average once every 4 days. The worst single disaster in American maritime history was not a reef or a torpedo. It was the steamship Sultana, which exploded on the Mississippi River in April 1865, killing over 1,500 Union soldiers just released from Confederate prison camps. Boilerplates were thrown a quarter mile, entire buildings collapsed. And because there were no federal inspection standards, no uniform construction codes, nothing but the skill of the boilermaker and the luck of the fireman standing beside it, the steam age was simultaneously more productive and more lethal than anything that had come before. The second force that killed the water sawmill was the circular saw, arriving in the 1830s and 1840s. The sash sawmill cut on 1 stroke out of 2. The upstroke was wasted motion. The blade rose through air, reset, and then cut again on the way down. That meant that half of every revolution of the water wheel, half of every impulse of power from the stream, was spent moving the saw in a direction that accomplished nothing. The circular saw eliminated that waste entirely. The blade spun continuously, no reciprocating, no return stroke, no dead time, just constant rotation, constant cutting, at a pace the old sash mills could never approach. The first circular blades were crude, up to half an inch thick, producing cuts that one observer described as resembling washboards more than lumber. But the technology improved quickly. Thinner blades, harder steel, better tooth geometry. Then came the bandsaw, which wasted even less wood with its thinner kerf. Then came the railroad, which freed the sawmill from its ancient dependency on navigable water. Logs could be shipped by rail to the mill rather than the mill being built wherever a stream happened to fall. By the 1880s, circular saws had replaced nearly all the old sash sawmills across the country. By the end of the century, a writer described the sash mill as being as much an antiquity as the old domestic spinning wheel. The machine that had built America was already a relic within living memory of the men who ran it. The circular saw cut faster, but it also killed differently. Where the sash mill's danger was patient, it lived in the daily routine, in the exposed blade, the slippery floor, the unlucky stumble. The circular saw's danger was explosive. Kickback. When the wood caught the back of the spinning blade and was hurled at the operator, a plank could be driven through a stone wall. The circular blade stored enormous rotational energy and released it in an instant, with no warning and no opportunity for reaction. A man standing at the feed end of a circular saw had no more than a fraction of a second between the moment the wood caught and the moment it hit him, if there was any gap at all. In the shingle mills of the Pacific Northwest in the 1890s, workers pushed cedar blocks through massive circular saws 30,000 times in a 10-hour shift, not once every few minutes, 30,000 times, one push every second, for 10 hours straight, every working day, for years. They were recognized around town by their missing fingers. They called themselves shingle weavers. The nickname carried a grim pride, the pride of men who did frightening work because the lumber had to be cut, because the cities were rising, because the wages were what they were and the alternatives were fewer. No guard, no safety mechanism, no compensation when the blade took a finger or a hand or more. A man who lost fingers to a circular saw received his wages for the days he could work and nothing for the days he could not. There was no workers' compensation. There was no occupational safety regulation. There was just the blade and the cedar block and the 30,000 repetitions, and yet the lumber had to be cut. Seattle, Portland, Tacoma, the cities of the Pacific Northwest were rising out of the forest at a pace that demanded exactly that level of production. The houses, the docks, the warehouses, the school buildings, all of it required boards, and boards required men willing to stand at the saw and keep their count. The men who worked the factory floors connected to the great steam engines of the era faced a different version of the same bargain. Miles of overhead shafting running through every building, spinning constantly, studded with pulleys connected to machines by endless loops of leather belting. Oil dripped from the bearings above onto the floor. The machines, the workers' clothing, belts broke constantly. When they did, they whipped across the floor like giant leather snakes. Workers were struck, wrapped, pulled into gears. Getting a new belt onto a spinning pulley was so dangerous that veteran machinists treated it as a spectator event. One memoirist recalled that it was always an exciting adventure to watch a new man attempt the job. You could be fairly certain the belt would fly off instantly, but what made it interesting was trying to guess whether he would break a window or only hang himself on the rafters. That was not a joke. That was a Tuesday. There was no emergency shutoff on individual machines. The only way to stop a machine connected to a line shaft was to manually shift its belt from the drive pulley to a loose pulley while the shaft was still spinning. The bearings had to be greased by hand while the shafts turned. Pulley lubricator was an actual job title, a man whose entire shift was spent climbing ladders with an oil can, reaching between spinning components, keeping friction from starting fires. The great engines that powered these systems ran so smoothly and quietly that observers marveled at them, but the systems they powered were something else. The engine didn't know when a belt broke. It didn't feel like a man was caught. It just kept feeding power into the system the way a heart keeps pumping blood even when the body is bleeding. Step back from the blade for a moment and look at what all of this produced. By the 1790s, New England alone was exporting 36 million feet of pine boards and 300 shipmasts every year, most of it cut by water power. The homes, the barns, the churches, the wharves, the forts, all of it sawn by rivers, one stroke at a time. The entire westward expansion of the 19th century rode on lumber. Every new settlement on the frontier followed the same pattern. Find a stream, build a dam, raise a mill, start cutting. The town followed the mill the way a body follows a heartbeat. You cannot understand American westward expansion if you do not understand the sawmill, because the mill was always first, before the schoolhouse, before the church, before the saloon. The mill. Every colonial saltbox, every federal period meeting house, every weathered barn leaning into the wind on a Vermont hillside traces its bones back to a river, a wheel, and a blade moving up and down in a wooden frame. That is not a metaphor. That is a physical fact visible in the wood grain of the oldest buildings still standing on the eastern seaboard. When you look at the hand-hewn beams in an 18th century New England farmhouse, you are looking at the output of a machine powered by a stream that may have run dry 150 years ago, operated by a man whose name is not recorded anywhere, who sharpened the blade by hand and listened to the water to know if the wheel was turning fast enough, and kept his fingers away from a saw that did not know the difference between pine and bone. The mill owner was frequently the wealthiest and most politically influential man in the community, because controlling the water meant controlling the pace at which the town could grow, and that power was understood clearly by everyone who depended on it. When mill owners cut corners on dam construction, or diverted water from neighbors, or ran the mill at times that damaged upstream farming, the courts heard about it immediately. The sawmill sat at the center of community life in ways that are hard to imagine now, part utility, part economy, part social institution. Today, a handful of these machines survive. The Ledyard up-down sawmill in Connecticut is the last sash sawmill in the United States, still standing on its original site with its original mechanism intact. It was saved in 1966, barely in time, when members of the local historical society recognized what was about to vanish. Volunteers spent years restoring it through the 1970s, and it has been running again since 1975. You can visit on Saturday afternoons in the spring and fall. Stand inside the mill building, feel the stone floor tremble under your feet. Watch the sash rise and fall and the blade rasp through timber exactly the way it did when the mill was young. There is no admission charge. There is just the sound of the saw and the smell of fresh-cut wood and the steady pulse of water doing what gravity has always done. At Old Sturbridge Village in Massachusetts, a reproduction sash mill cuts lumber for the museum's own restoration projects. At Hanford Mills in the Catskills of New York, a massive Fitz overshot water wheel still powers the works, and thousands of visitors come every year to see something most Americans have entirely forgotten existed. These places are not museums in the usual sense. They are the last living examples of a technology that shaped the physical surface of a continent. The machines are not behind glass. They run, the saw moves, the water flows, the building shakes, and for a few minutes, standing inside one of them, you understand what it meant to build a civilization out of nothing but river and wood and human persistence. A modern sawmill produces 2 million board feet in a day. It uses lasers and computers and optimization software that calculates the most efficient possible cut for every individual log before the blade ever touches it. It is fast, precise, and genuinely extraordinary. A colonial sash sawmill produced 1,000 board feet. It was powered by a stream no wider than a road. It was built mostly from the same material it cut. It was run by one man who sharpened the blade by hand, listened to the water to know if the wheel was turning fast enough, and kept his fingers away from a saw that did not know the difference between pine and bone. One of those machines built the modern world. The other one built the world that made the modern world possible. the men who worked them, the pitmen coughing sawdust in their holes in the ground, the millwrights calculating water drop and gear ratio in their heads, the sawyers listening to the blade for the note that meant danger, the shingle weavers counting 30,000 strokes in a shift, the dam keepers watching the face of the embankment for the crack that meant catastrophe. Those men are almost entirely without names in the historical record. They are present in every old board still nailed to an old wall, in every hand-split shingle on an old Vermont barn, in every beam you can reach up and touch a colonial-era house that has been standing for 3 centuries and has no intention of stopping. They built a continent one board at a time, in the sound of falling water and the scream of iron and wood. They don't make them like that anymore. Not the machines, not the mills, and not the men who stood beside them day after day, season after season, building a world. The pit saw gave way to water wheels, and water wheels gave way to steam and spinning blades. One man replaced 20. 1,000 boards replaced 12. Rivers powered a civilization into existence, board by board, mill by mill, town by town. The machines had no guards and no mercy. The men had no names and no compensation. They listened to blades, watched dams, counted 30,000 strokes a shift, and lost fingers to saws that didn't know the difference. They built the world that built the modern world. The water still falls, the old boards still stand,